This video is brought to you in part by OmniAtlas. Feedback from viewers and patrons is one of the most important parts of my creative process, and probably the most common compliment I get is for my maps, whether they be for cities or the political maps of countries and regions. The cities I do myself, but the latter would be impossible without OmniAtlas, a free interactive historical atlas which shows step-by-step historical maps covering major world and regional events. Unlike many other historical atlases, OmniAtlas seeks to show political influence and control, not just territorial claims or legal definitions, so that means disputed territories, invading armies, rebellions, you name it. I started working with OmniAtlas years before I started my channel, and the quality of my videos would not be possible without OmniAtlas providing their pre-existing maps or their template and style guide for making my own maps. You can check out their link in the description. Now, on with the show. It's a common misconception that prior to the destruction of the Jewish temple in the year 70, the majority of the world's Jews lived in the land of Judea, and that it was only after the temple's destruction that the Jews entered a diaspora across 3 and later 6 continents. While this narrative is far from universal, it has nevertheless transcended many of the severe religious and political divisions within the Jewish world. If you're Jewish, this is probably what you were taught as a child. And if you've watched many of my videos, you already understand that this narrative is dangerously oversimplified. But rather than making you rewatch all of them, I think a little recap is in order. As early as 200 BCE, the majority of the world's Jews already lived outside Judea, benefiting from the vast political and economic networks established by the Persian, Macedonian, and eventually Roman empires. Judea itself, meanwhile, continued to be a majority Jewish region for nearly 3 centuries after the temple's destruction, and Jews continued to be the majority for centuries more in cities like Tiberias, which was a major center of Jewish thought well into the Islamic Golden Age. Inasmuch as one can give an end date to the Jewish character of Palestine, it is not the 1st century, but the 11th, when the vast majority of Jews living there were either driven out, killed in battle, or indiscriminately slaughtered in the First Crusade. And that's when something interesting happened. From that point on, the physical act of returning suddenly took on a significance that it hadn't had before. In the 12th century, the rabbi, physician, and poet Hula Levi became the first person of note to attempt such a return, which he gave the name Aliyah, or ascent, from the declaration of Koresh the Great in the biblical book of Ezra, itself owing to Jerusalem's position atop the Judean mountains. Later that century, the great Maimonides lived in Tiberias for a time and was later buried there. And in the 13th century, with the Crusader states rapidly withering away, the Rabbi Nachmanides resettled in Jerusalem, permanently activating the Jewish community of Palestine back into a coherent bloc which came to be known as the Old Yishuv. During the early modern period, both Suleiman the Magnificent and Dar Omar made aggressive efforts to encourage Jewish resettlement in Palestine. And while they were technically successful, they weren't nearly as successful as they'd hoped. And there are 2 main reasons for this. First, unless you were being forced out of your existing home, moving to the economically and environmentally ravaged Palestine was a costly and unpleasant burden, which is why most people who did it were rabbis and mystics. Second, and this may surprise you, the idea of Aliyah as nation building was widely considered heretical, especially by hardline traditionalists who viewed Maimonides' description of messianic prophecy as a literal instruction that the kibbutz galuyot, or ingathering of exiles, could only be validated by the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Perhaps less surprisingly, the least successful efforts of this kind were those by the mostly English Protestant movements known collectively as Restorationists. In 1666, during the messianic mania surrounding Shabtai Tzvi, a radical sect of Puritans called the Fifth Monarchists believed that Tzvi was the second coming of Jesus, and that following his leading of the Jewish people back to Palestine, they would all convert to Christianity, a concept later revived in 1809 by the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, most famously led by an eccentric parliamentary backbencher named Anthony Ashley Cooper, later Earl of Shaftesbury. Though these groups in their own time were known as Restorationists, they are now often retroactively dubbed Christian Zionists, either by Christian fundamentalists seeking to appropriate the Zionist movement, or by anti-Zionists seeking to discredit it. The mid-19th century did, however, see the rise of the so-called Proto-Zionists. Following his 3 visits to Palestine in the 1820s and 30s, Sir Moses Montefiore began to set up financial and educational initiatives to bring Western-style agricultural practices to the region. Though devoutly religious himself, Montefiore was the first Jewish figure of the modern era to conceive of Aliyah beyond the scope of religion, envisioning Palestine as much as a safe haven for Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere as a place for religious fulfillment. Montefiore also initiated a program to expand the city of Jerusalem beyond its medieval walls, not only drawing Jews out of the crowded old city, but also from outlying cities like Hebron and Safed, as well as from abroad. And by the time the Zionist movement had begun in earnest, Jerusalem was already a predominantly Jewish city. At the same time, Montefiore's French counterpart Adolphe Crémieux helped establish his own agricultural school at Mikveh Yisrael just outside the port city of Jaffa, which was quickly expanding beyond its medieval walls. And by 1878, new Jewish agricultural villages had been established at Petach Tikva, Geoni, and very briefly in the Hauran. Taking inspiration from both Montefiore and Crémieux, as well as nationalist movements in his native Balkans, the rabbi and mystic Yehuda Alkalai began several initiatives to encourage Jewish resettlement. Similarly, the Prussian rabbinic scholar Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer saw a return to agriculture in Palestine as a solution to widespread poverty and persecution among the vast Jewish population in the neighboring Russian Empire. And finally, in 1862, the arguable father of social democracy, Moses Hess, published Rome and Jerusalem, which asserted the gradual emergence of a Jewish state in Palestine as a natural consequence of ongoing trends in modern Jewish and European history. However, this Proto-Zionism struggled to gain traction among the masses, in no small part because their efforts were concentrated in Western Europe, where Jews already had full political rights and the Industrial Revolution had brought considerable prosperity. Palestine, meanwhile, was desperately poor, depopulated, and devastated by centuries of deforestation by the Romans and neglect by subsequent powers. The region had no sewage systems, no electricity, no railroads, no industry. The militant agrarianism championed by the Proto-Zionists appealed little to their urban peers, and it's telling that of the 5 men I mentioned, only Alkalai made Aliyah himself. Even the agricultural settlements that already existed were struggling to survive, as participating families quickly fled to the relative prosperity of the cities. By 1880, it was clear that a true mass movement of Jewish repatriation would require a population who possessed both conviction in the cause of national renewal and the desperation of having nowhere else to go. In 1871, Odessa was one of the most diverse cities in the world. While ethnic Russians constituted the largest share of the population, it was also home to the second largest Jewish population of any city in the world, as well as sizable communities of Armenians, Tatars, Italians, Turks, and Greeks. Odessa's semi-Mediterranean location, diversity, and importance as a trading hub made it the intellectual center of Jewish pluralism and politics in Eastern Europe. But all of those factors also made the Jews of Odessa easy targets for violence whenever there was tension between one or more groups. In 1871, when the city's Greek church was vandalized during the Orthodox Easter, Greek and later Russian communities engaged in 3 days of rioting against the Jews, whom they simply presumed to be guilty for religious reasons. Much of the city was destroyed, while the Russian military and law enforcement stood idly by. This was not the first pogrom committed against Jews in Odessa, nor was it even the first pogrom incited by the local Greek church. But it came at a significant time in the Jewish history of Europe, when Enlightenment and liberal democracy were beginning to show their limits with regards to the Jewish question. To quote historian Jonathan Frankel, the periodic crises which interrupted the day-to-day patterns of Jewish life were not aberrations, the final thrashing of a dying past, but on the contrary were symptomatic of the modern era. In Odessa, a 52-year-old doctor named Leon Pinsker became the face of this disillusionment. Pinsker was a second-generation Maskil secularist who had been raised in the movement to revive the Hebrew language, and had spent most of his life as an advocate for Jewish emancipation in Russia. As a physician, he sought to use a scientific approach and diagnose a root cause of this millennia-long prejudice. With the assassination of Emperor Alexander II, the outbreak of pogroms across Ukraine, and the implementation of numerous anti-Jewish laws, Pinsker came to his conclusion that Jews were everywhere foreigners except for their indigenous homeland, and would never be accepted as equals among nations unless they achieved equality as a nation. On New Year's Day, 1882, he published his pamphlet Autoemancipation, opening with the famous words of Rabbi Hillel the Elder, "If I am not for myself, who is for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?"
Since the Jew is nowhere at home, nowhere regarded as a native, he remains an alien everywhere. That he himself and his ancestors as well are born in the country does not alter this fact in the least. In the great majority of cases, he is treated as a stepchild, as a Cinderella. In the most favorable cases, he is regarded as an adopted child whose rights may be questioned. Never is he considered a legitimate child of the fatherland. The legal emancipation of the Jews is the culminating achievement of our century. But legal emancipation is not social emancipation. And with the proclamation of the former, the Jews are still far from being emancipated from their exceptional social position.
Though he never mentioned Moses Hess by name, Pinsker acknowledged that he wasn't the first person to conceive of a secular struggle for Jewish national independence. But Pinsker was much more interested in identifying why this particular moment in history was causing people to entertain such notions. Pinsker probably correctly attributed it to the breakdown of Jewish orthodoxy and the declining temporal power of rabbis and their courts. As I said, in most schools of Jewish thought, the idea of taking an active role in restoring Jewish independence had become heretical. The memories of the Maccabean Revolt and the Jewish-Roman Wars had been mythologized from the conscious actions of human beings to divine struggles, which we mere mortals can no longer dare contemplate. The Messiah, a once purely political and philosophical concept, had developed an untouchable mystical nature. But the rise of secularism, as well as the Jewish Enlightenment and the Jewish Studies movement, had inspired a more analytic approach. Remember that Jewish emancipation didn't just mean emancipation from persecution by the state, but also from persecution by Jewish leadership. And it was the success of emancipation, to the extent that Pinsker was willing to acknowledge it, that it enabled the reawakening of a Jewish national consciousness.
Mistaken as this movement has proved to be by its results, it was nevertheless a right instinct to strike out for home. At the very outset, we expected a great outcry, but faint heart never won fair lady. And indeed, what have we to lose?
Autoemancipation was a hit. Just 10 days after its release, the Romanian rabbi and linguist Moses Gaster joined with several other Jewish leaders at the Focșani Congress. Romania was yet another nation where Jewish emancipation seemed to be a lost cause, and the Congress thus endeavored to establish an agricultural village for Romanian refugees in Palestine known as Shomron, or Samaria. Shortly after that, university students in Ukraine formed the Palestine Pioneers, or Bilu, who by the end of the year had established the new towns of Rishon LeZion and Rosh Pinah, soon followed by Yesod HaMa'ala. Though Pinsker envisioned Autoemancipation as a movement by and for the Jews of Eastern Europe, neither its core concepts nor the traumatic experiences that had informed them were unique to that region. Far to the south in Yemen, a ruling dynasty of Zaidi imams had enforced severe anti-Jewish laws since the 17th century, and life within the Jewish community was extremely chaotic, with frequent pogroms, forced relocations, and multiple messianic claimants in just the 19th century alone. During that period, the Yemenites were visited by the rabbi and anthropologist Yaakov Safir, who helped suppress the messianic cults of personality and encouraged the Jews to find peace and security in his home of Palestine. In the decades following the Ottoman conquest of Yemen in 1872, some 2,500 souls took up Safir's offer, making up 10% of Jewish immigrants. The situation was similar in the Emirate of Bukhara, where the Russian invasion of 1868 ended years of war and banditry, inspiring rabbis Shlomo Musayev and Shimon Chacham to establish the Bukharan quarter in Jerusalem, though their motivations were more traditionally religious than humanitarian. Taken together, this wave of Jewish immigration came to be known somewhat controversially as the First Aliyah, and those who participated in it were known as Chovevei Tzion, or Lovers of Zion, from which auto-emancipation came to be known by a new term, Zionism. Now, while all of these groups were inspired by auto-emancipation, they were not a monolithic group, or even an organized one. And the newly established communities were already in dire shape, as most of them were established on uncultivated hilltops that needed to be landscaped, and most of the people taking part in the project had no experience as farmers. Most of these would-be settlers ended up moving to nearby cities like Jaffa and Haifa, if not leaving the country entirely. In 1883, Baron Edmund de Rothschild agreed to bail out the settlement of Shomron with some much-needed investments on the condition that the village be renamed after his late father, Zichron Yaakov. The same year, he helped establish another village in the south, named Mazkeret Batya after his mother. This was chaos. Clearly there needed to be a system in place. And in November 1884, the foremost leadership of Hovevei Zion met in the Austrian city of Katowice to iron out a clear plan. But even the meager points they were able to agree on were never fully carried out. Nevertheless, the Hovevei Zion Central Committee was functional enough to wrangle some of the more experienced agriculturalists to form a series of so-called daughter colonies. Now, at this point it's probably worth discussing what the Ottoman authorities thought about all of this. Well, back in 1839, the Ottomans had a young, dynamic new sultan in Abdulmejid I, who immediately began a series of reforms to bring the empire more in line with Western nations, by reforming the legal system and steadily abolishing religious discrimination. Following a triumphant victory over Russia in the Crimean War, Abdulmejid consolidated all of these reforms into the Reform Edict of 1856, which among other things made all men in the empire equal citizens, universalized eligibility for the military and civil service, and almost completely eliminated the temporal power of religious authorities. Almost completely. Religious authorities retained their monopoly on marriage and divorce, and in most of the former territories of the empire they still do, including Israel. One important thing the Reform Edict also did was to make it legal for non-citizens to own land, and it's not a coincidence that people like Moses Montefiore and Adolphe Crémieux immediately started buying up land in Palestine for housing and agricultural projects. The Sultan was all for this. He saw it as a good investment, and for the most part encouraged Jewish migration into the empire, Palestine or otherwise. Altogether, Abdulmejid was a very modern, reform-minded leader who wanted to integrate the empire politically and economically with the West. But with his death in 1861, a convoluted power struggle ensued which resulted in the ascension of his son Abdulhamid II, who was none of those things. He was initially open to a larger Jewish presence, but after seeing the events unfolding in Russia and Romania, he and his ministers got cold feet. They'd seen what Russian meddling had done to the Balkans, and they would not allow Hovevei Zion to do the same to the Levant. By November of 1881, he decreed that Jewish immigrants to the empire would still be welcome, but not in Palestine. Unfortunately for them, this rule was basically unenforceable, partly because it wasn't actually a law. It was never properly decreed, and we only know about it because members of Hovevei Zion had asked about it. If Abdulhamid hadn't already suspended the Ottoman constitution, it probably would have been unconstitutional. It was also unenforceable because Palestine wasn't actually an administrative region of the empire. What people colloquially referred to as Palestine, or Eretz Yisrael in Hebrew, was actually divided between the vilayets of Syria and Beirut and the Mutasarrafate of Jerusalem. Any attempts to close loopholes in their regulations only created new ones. And in 1888, the Porte decreed that Jewish settlement in Palestine would be restricted to those arriving only as families or individuals, which was nothing more than a tacit admission of failure. But then things got a little crazy. Between 1890 and 1891, the outbreak of famine and coinciding expulsion of Jews from Moscow massively escalated the ongoing Jewish exodus from the Pale of Settlement. And while most chose to resettle in Britain or America, Ottoman Palestine was not immune from a surge in new arrivals. This brief period is sometimes called the Panic Aliyah, and rightly so. The Jews were panicking, the Sultan was panicking, and even the Russian Emperor Alexander III was panicking, because although he actively encouraged Jewish emigration to rid himself of an unwanted minority, he also saw the growing Jewish presence in Palestine as a threat to his interests in the region. Furthermore, the Mutasarrifate of Jerusalem ended a long-standing ban on selling government-owned land to Jews, resulting in a massive speculative bubble that saw many impoverished newcomers borrow far beyond their means to purchase lots that only drove prices up further. Even many local Arabs began buying up vacant land in order to resell to Jews at a markup. But the actual effect was that most people were completely priced out, and everyone else would surely go bankrupt the moment the bubble burst. At exactly this moment, Leon Pinsker died, and this created a problem. Even after the Katowice conference, Zionism still wasn't really a movement so much as a loose association of intellectuals and nonprofit initiatives with a vaguely common goal. Its leading voices were all poets and philosophers, and inasmuch as it had a leader, it was just whoever in the movement had the most domineering personality. Until now, that had been Pinsker, but with him gone, the top figure in the Zionist movement was also the movement's most ferocious critic. No Zionist had ever been more ambivalent about being a Zionist. And as it turned out, that was exactly what they needed. Asher Tzvi Hirsch Ginsburg was born in 1856 to a Chabad family of unusual wealth and privilege in rural Ukraine. Asher's father allowed him only one meal a day on principle, beat him every Saturday night, belittled his intelligence constantly, and banned him from studying geometry and algebra, which he had mastered by the age of 11, over family fears that he was practicing witchcraft. Ginsburg had also taught himself Russian against his parents' wishes. His only friends were his sisters and his dog. By 12, he had abandoned Hasidism, and by 15, he had given up religion entirely. According to his sister Esther Shimkin, Asher was a very sensitive, fidgety, lonely kid with a great love of nature, an exceptional talent for language, an intense sense of justice and morality, though not the morality of his upbringing, and an uncompromising disdain for authority. These were all skills that would serve him well. But there was another that would prove even more important. Lacking the confidence to seek out a formal university education, Ginsburg instead taught himself several more languages, as well as philosophy and chemistry. But his father's ailing health forced him to take charge of their estate. Now, let's be clear, he hated this, but he was also really good at it. And though the concept didn't exist yet, it would be fair to call Ginsburg an early pioneer in the discipline of business administration. So here's a guy who does whatever the f*** he wants, but he can do that because he actually knows what he's talking about and is also an expert in how to successfully manage people and systems. Do you see where this is going? In 1884, Ginsburg finally left home for Odessa, where he was almost immediately elected to the Central Committee of Chovevei Zion. I didn't say this before, but Ginsburg actually participated in the Katowice conference. Meanwhile, the implementation of the May laws caused Ginsburg's family to lose their estate. His father was actually friends with Count Ignatiev, the architect of the anti-Jewish laws, and could probably have gotten an exception, but young Asher forbid it. His father then suggested moving to Palestine, and Asher said no. If they were going to make a new life there, it had to be by working the land themselves, not hiring other poor people to do it. So they came to Odessa with him, and it was at this point that Asher Ginsburg, both figuratively and literally, made his name. In November 1888, a Broke Ginsburg submitted an article to the Hebrew magazine Hamagid titled "This Is Not the Way," in which he eloquently and comprehensively demolished the state of the Zionist movement, if only in an effort to save it from total collapse. If you couldn't already tell, early Zionism was dominated by armchair generals. Few, if anyone, in the Central Committee of Chovevei Zion had ever even been to Palestine. And rather than draw their plans from tangible data or experience, the attitude of people like Pinsker was just to throw money at people to buy some land and assume that eventually all the world's Jews would reunite in their ancient home. Ginsburg hadn't been to Palestine either, at least not yet, but he understood logistics. And he pointed out that the idea of gathering all the world's Jews in Palestine was not only unnecessary, but impossible. At this time, the global Jewish population was about 9 million. But even at its first century peak, Judea's Jewish population never numbered more than 2 million. and even then they were outnumbered by Jews in diaspora. Furthermore, Palestine was in terrible economic shape. Was it any wonder then that for every Jew who fled Russia for Palestine, 40 were going to the United States? And rightly so. As to those who did go to Palestine, they were totally unequipped for the realities of living there, of the climate or their neighbors or the work of agriculture. Pinsker and his allies had assumed that a change of scenery alone would restore the might and dignity of the Jewish people. But to Ginsburg, freeing the Jewish mind had to come first, a reflection of the self-confidence issues that plagued him his entire life. In order to emphasize that he wasn't interested in a literary or political career, Ginsburg chose to publish his polemic under a pseudonym, One of the People. As far as he was concerned, he was just another face in the crowd. But he was wrong, and so the pseudonym became his new name. If Leon Pinsker could even comprehend the reality of the situation, he made no indication of it. But Ahad Ha'am had shaken many of his allies out of their complacency. When Pinsker died in 1891, the institution of Hovevei Zion never recovered. But Zionism was bouncing back. It had a new leader, and he had some more thoughts. In the winter and spring of 1891, Hovevei Zion sent Ha'am on a fact-finding mission to Palestine. What he found there was unsurprising, but nevertheless disappointing, which he reported back in yet another polemic, Truth from the Land of Israel. He loved the land. It pained him to leave, and he would eventually settle there permanently. But the state of the Yishuv was untenable. Unemployment was rampant. Most Olim were living off donations from Hovevei Zion or other aid organizations. What little industry existed was mostly in winemaking, which was over-dependent on foreign investment. But most of all, he despaired of the contempt with which his own people treated the local Arabs.
We who live abroad are accustomed to believe that almost all of Palestine is now uninhabited desert, and whoever wishes can buy land there as he pleases. But this is not true. It's very difficult to find in the land cultivated fields that aren't used for planting, and not only peasants but also rich landowners are not selling good land so easy. We who live abroad are accustomed to believing that the Arabs are all wild desert people, like donkeys, neither see nor understand what is happening around them. But this is a grave mistake. The Arab, like all Semites, is sharp-minded and shrewd. We must surely learn from both our past and present history to handle these people with love and respect, and needless to say with justice and good judgment. And what do our brothers do? Exactly the opposite. They were slaves in their diasporas, and suddenly they find themselves with unlimited freedom. The sudden change has planted despotic tendencies in their hearts, as always happens to former slaves. Our brothers indeed were right when they said that the Arab only respects he who exhibits bravery and courage. But when these people feel that the law is on their rival's side, and even more so if they are right to think that their rival's actions are unjust and oppressive, these people will be revengeful like no other.
To Ahad Ha'am, the ill-suitedness of the settlers and their mistreatment of the Arabs were intrinsically tied, and they had a common solution. If Jews truly wanted to return to their ancestral way of life, they had to look to the Arabs, eat like them, dress like them, negotiate like them, learn to speak Arabic if possible. In fact, Ahad Ha'am didn't believe there should be a Jewish state, instead envisioning Palestine as the cultural and spiritual axis of the wider Jewish world, independent of any petty political ambitions. This was a difficult thing for many people to hear, but Ha'am had demonstrated a credibility gap between himself and other Zionists which forced them to take his criticism seriously. And over the next decade, in spite of everything going against them, the number of new settlements doubled. In reality, the situation wasn't quite as dire as Ha'am thought. In 1892, the Mutasarrifate of Jerusalem reimposed its ban against Jewish purchases of government-owned land, stabilizing prices. The closure of public land in Jerusalem only encouraged further Jewish investment in the Sharon Plain and the Galilee, where Jerusalem-based policies didn't apply, and the land was actually better for farming, provided you didn't die from malaria. And lest we forget, Palestine had lots of Jewish noble families who'd owned large tracts of land for centuries, like Yosef Navon, who in 1892 commissioned the construction of Greater Syria's very first railway, connecting Jaffa and Jerusalem. Ahad Ha'am's ideas also had the unintended effect of popularizing Zionism outside of Europe. Whereas most Zionist leaders in Europe sought to frame their movement as an unprecedented clean break from history, others, like Aziz ben Yonah Naim in Persia, correctly identified it as merely the latest iteration of centuries of Jewish thought. Meanwhile, in the United States, Henrietta Zold, having made a name for herself by exposing the Treffa banquet, gave a speech to the National Council of Jewish Women in direct support of Ahad Ha'am, and would later become one of the foremost advocates of Jewish-Arab binationalism. But for all its success over this period, the first Aliyah would still be remembered in hindsight as a failure. Only a third of Jewish immigrants had stuck it out and remained in the country. The Zionist movement as a whole remained divided over what their movement actually was. Were they planning for an eventual state, or just a cultural homeland? And in spite of all this effort, Zionism remained a fringe movement in the wider world of Jewish thought. As the 19th century neared its close, the course of Jewish history, for all its changes, triumphs, and dead ends, seems no clearer or more coherent than it had 100 years earlier. But before the century ends, we must give it a proper farewell. And to do that, we must return to the place where we began it. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshel Gordon, Sergei Herasimov, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and Chris Nelson.